Isn't it strange? You see these leaders, right? The ones who, well, seem to make things worse for most people, but somehow they stick around in power much longer than leaders who actually deliver economic growth.
Yeah, it really does feel counterintuitive at first glance.
Like the whole logic is backwards. What's going on there?
Well, it's puzzling on the surface, definitely, but when you start to unpack the different ways political systems work, you begin to see a kind of logic emerge. A sometimes unsettling logic, maybe?
Yes, so let's do that. Let's dig into it. We're doing a deep dive today, looking at some really interesting research on, political competition, economic growth, specifically work by Bruce Bueno de Mesquita and his colleagues.
Right. Their work tackles this exact puzzle.
So the mission today is what? To figure out how these different political setups create incentives for leaders. Like, why do some focus on helping everyone while others just seem to focus on staying in charge, even if it hurts people?
Exactly. That's the core question. What makes a leader prioritize public well-being versus just, their own political survival?
And to get a handle on this, we need to understand a few key ideas they talk about. The selectorate, the winning coalition,
Yeah.
public goods, and private benefits.
Yeah, those terms might sound a bit academic, but they're really the keys to unlocking this whole thing.
They help explain why some leaders seem to, well, get away with bad governance, maybe?
Precisely. They give us a framework to see who actually has clout in a system and what leaders need to do to keep their jobs.
Okay, lay the groundwork for us. Any political system, they say, has two main groups we need to think about. First up, the selectorate. What is that exactly?
So the selectorate is basically everyone who has at least some theoretical chance of influencing politics. Think of it as the pool of potential supporters.
Okay.
In a democracy like the US or the UK with universal suffrage, it's huge. Pretty much all adult citizens who can vote. Everyone has a potential voice, even if it feels small individually.
Right, so in democracies, that pool is massive.
Yeah.
But that's not always true, is it?
Oh, not at all. Think about, say, medieval England. When Richard I died, the people who actually picked the next king, it was like 197 barons and the Pope. That was the selectorate.
Wow, tiny.
Tiny. The vast majority had zero say. Or, many autocracies or military juntas today, the selectorate can be a pretty small, closed group.
Okay, I get it. Selectorate who could be influential. What about the second group, the winning coalition? That sounds even more exclusive.
It absolutely is. The winning coalition is the crucial subset within the selectorate. These are the people whose support is non-negotiable for the leader.
The essential ones.
The essential ones. If this group pulls its support, the leader's probably out. And, critically, members of this winning coalition, they often get special perks, advantages that others don't.
Ah, okay, so selectorate is who could matter. Winning coalition is who really matters. Can you give us some examples to make that distinction clearer?
Sure. Think about Bill Clinton in the U.S. His winning coalition was basically the voters who put him over the top and kept his party relevant. They didn't get, bags of cash, but his policies were aimed at benefiting those key groups.
Okay.
Now contrast that with, say, Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Everyone could technically vote, but his power really depended on a much smaller group.
The Republican Guard, his own clan, they were his winning coalition.
And their loyalty was bought differently?
Absolutely. Through significant private benefits, money, power protection, that was the deal. Or think about King Leopold in the Congo. His winning coalition, essentially the forced public, his private army enforcing his rule. Their loyalty, paid for by the Congo's wealth, kept him in power there.
Very different ways to secure power. One needs millions, the other may be just a few thousand key people.
Precisely.
Which leads us to this idea they call the paradox of politics. Sounds kind of grim. What is it?
Yeah, the core idea is sometimes doing what seems like the right thing, good policies that help most people, can actually be bad for a leader's political survival.
Really? Especially in systems where the leader doesn't need broad public support. And conversely, policies that seem terrible for the country, things that cause poverty or stifle competition, can actually help certain leaders hang on to power longer.
That's quite sobering. So how does a leader manage this? How do they stay in power? It comes down to resources, right? How they spend the money.
Exactly. Leaders control the state's resources, usually from taxes, and they face this constant choice. How do I use this money to keep my winning coalition happy and stay in charge? They can basically choose between public goods and private benefits.
Okay, public goods, that's stuff like national defense, roads, clean water, schools, things we all benefit from, more or less.
Right. Things that improve life for society generally.
And private benefits, that sounds more like Special favors.
That's exactly it. Special deals, corruption opportunities, jobs for cronies, legal immunity, targeted tax breaks, perks just for the winning coalition members.
So the leader weighs up. Spend on things for everyone, or spend on things just for my essential supporters. And the size of that winning coalition is key to which strategy works best.
Absolutely critical. The smaller the winning coalition, the more sense it makes for the leader to focus on showering that small group with private goodies.
Okay, let's unpack that. Small winning coalitions, like in many autocracies, what happens there?
Loyalty is the name of the game. Because the winning coalition is small, right? But the selectorate, the pool of potential replacements, is often much bigger.
Ah, okay.
So if you're in that small winning group and you think about defecting, it's super risky. Why? Because the leader can easily find someone else from the wider selectorate to take your privileged spot. You're probably not indispensable to the next guy.
So you stick with the current leader who's giving you perks.
You stick loyal. And the leader knows this, so they focus resources on keeping that small group happy with private benefits. It doesn't even have to cost that much overall compared to funding massive public projects. Their loyalty is secured, even if the country as a whole isn't doing well.
And that's where bad policy is good politics comes in. Neglecting the wider public good helps keep resources focused on the essential few.
Pretty much, yeah. It can short the leader's position. And this ties into kleptocracy, too, ruled by theft. The research suggests it's more likely when government spending is low compared to revenue.
How so?
Well, if you're a leader with a small coalition, you're spending less on broad public goods anyway. More resources are potentially available for, personal enrichment or bribing that inner circle directly.
Okay, that paints a clear, if slightly depressing picture. Now, flip side. Large winning coalitions, like in most democracies, how does that change things?
It changes the calculation quite a bit. With a large winning coalition, the loyalty of any one member isn't as critical. If one voter, or even a small group, defects, the leader likely still has enough support.
Right.
So trying to buy off millions of individuals with private benefits, it's impractical. It's too expensive and complex.
So what do they do instead?
They have to focus on providing public goods, policies that benefit large chunks of the population, good schools, healthcare, a strong economy, rule of law. That's how you keep a large coalition satisfied. Effective public policy becomes the route to staying in office.
So in democracies, doing good things for lots of people actually helps the leader politically, because they need that broad base. Makes sense. And what about how long leaders stay in power?
Well, the data suggests democracies tend to see more turnover. Leaders change more often.
Why's that?
Because they're judged more directly on performance by that large coalition. If they don't deliver those public goods, if the economy tanks or services decline, they're more likely to get voted out. Autocrats with their loyal small group can often ride out tougher times more easily.
This sounds logical, but does the evidence actually back it up? When you look at the real world,
yeah, the researchers present some pretty strong evidence. First, they look at how their measures of coalition size line up with standard labels like democracy or autocracy. And, generally, democracies have large coalitions, autocracies have small ones. That holds up, especially at the extremes.
but not always perfectly. You mentioned some interesting cases.
Right, there are nuances. For example, Gorbachev's Soviet Union near the end. Their measure of coalition size started growing before the standard democracy scores really shifted much. It suggests influence was maybe spreading out a bit even before the system fully changed.
Interesting.
Or take Lee Kuan Yew's Singapore. Often gets middling democracy scores, but their model gave it a relatively high coalition size score, maybe reflecting that his policies, while perhaps authoritarian in some ways, did command fairly broad support or benefit a large group.
So just labeling a country democratic or autocratic might miss some of how power actually works inside it.
Exactly. Things like the pre-Civil War U.S., where only white men could vote, or India with its history of bloc voting. These systems might look democratic on paper, but the effective winning coalition could be smaller or function differently. The model tries to capture that.
Okay, what about the link to economic growth? That was the starting point.
The data there is pretty stark. On average, leaders in systems with larger winning coalitions, typically democracies, oversee significantly higher real growth in per capita income.
Like a noticeable difference.
A big difference over time. They did this calculation start with $500 income in 1950 under average democratic growth rates versus average autocratic growth rates by 2000, and projecting out to 2050, the gap becomes enormous.
Wow. So the need to satisfy more people really does seem to push leaders towards policies that grow the pie for everyone.
That seems to be the strong implication, and it's not just income.
What else?
Other indicators of public well-being tend to be better in large coalition systems, too. Things like access to safe drinking water, healthcare, support for free trade, lower corruption, less black market activity.
So broadly, better governance outcomes when leaders need broad support.
That's what the evidence points towards.
Okay, let's circle back to that initial puzzle then.
Yeah.
Why do the leaders who preside over poverty sometimes last longer? The data seems to confirm this too.
It does. The political survival data is quite clear. Autocrats, with their small coalitions, tend to stay in power much, much longer on average than democratic leaders.
How much longer?
Well, they found almost half of democratic leaders are gone within a year, whereas a quarter of autocrats last more than 8 years. There's just more stability or maybe inertia when you only need to keep a small group happy.
Even if the country's suffering.
Even then, which is kind of the grim part.
And it gets worse when you look at how policy choices affect their survival.
Oh, yeah.
Right? You mentioned some tables in the study.
Yes, tables 1 and 2 are. Well, they really highlight the paradox. For leaders with small coalitions, autocrats doing things considered bad policy, like allowing or encouraging black markets, actually seems to increase their chances of staying in power long term.
Wait, bad policy helps them survive.
Compared to implementing good policies like fostering genuine economic growth, it seems focusing on those private benefits for the few, maybe tolerating corruption or black markets that benefit the inner circle, is a more reliable survival strategy for them than trying to lift the whole economy.
That is the paradox right there. Bad for the country, good for the ruler's tenure. But the opposite is true for leaders in democracies.
Exactly the opposite. For leaders with large coalitions, promoting growth and having good economic policies improves their survival chances. They still face higher turnover overall, but doing the right thing helps them stay in power longer than doing the wrong thing. Their support depends on delivering for the many.
Wow. Okay. The study uses this striking example, doesn't it? The tale of two Leopolds.
Ah, yes. King Leopold II of Belgium. It's a fantastic natural experiment, in a grim sort of way.
How so?
Because he was ruling two places at once under totally different systems. He was the constitutional monarch of Belgium, which had a relatively large selectorate, a parliament, checks on his power. A bigger winning coalition was needed.
Okay, standard European monarchy of the time, more or less.
Right, and in Belgium. He oversaw industrialization, public works, reforms. He generally acted like a leader who needed broad support. He invested in public goods.
What?
But at the same time, he's the personal owner, the absolute sovereign of the Congo Free State. And there, his winning coalition was minuscule. Basically, the mercenaries and officials running his brutal resource extraction regime, the Force Publique, the Snectorate, was effectively just him.
So completely different incentives.
Completely.
Yeah.
In the Congo, there was zero focus on public goods. It was all about maximizing private profit for himself and his cronies through horrific exploitation, forced labor for rubber and ivory, unimaginable brutality.
The same man.
The same man, behaving in drastically different ways, depending entirely on the political system and the size of the coalition he needed to satisfy. In Belgium, public goods kept him legitimate. In the Congo, private plunder for a tiny group kept him in charge.
It really drives home the point that it's the system, the institutions, that shape behavior, maybe even more than the individual's character.
It strongly suggests that, yes, the incentives created by the coalition sides were paramount.
So if leaders only care about staying in power, what kind of system would they want?
Well, the research suggests if sheer survival is the only goal, a leader would probably prefer a system with a small winning coalition, but a large selectorate.
Why that combination?
The large selectorate makes it easy to replace defectors from the small winning coalition, keeping that core group loyal out of fear. Think rigged elections, lots of voters, selectorate, but only a small group's support actually matters, winning coalition. That maximizes the leader's leverage through private benefits.
But what if the coalition members themselves have a say?
Then it gets more complex. They might prefer systems where their loyalty isn't quite so locked in, maybe a small coalition, small selectorate system like an old monarchy, or even a large system like democracy, where they have more options or influence. And of course, people outside the winning coalition, they'd almost always prefer democracy because that's the system most likely to deliver public goods for everyone.
So it really hammers home that just hoping for good, civic-minded leaders isn't enough. The system itself has to push them in that direction.
Precisely. You need institutions that make leaders dependent on a large winning coalition, a large selectorate. You need to align their personal incentives staying in power with the public good. Democracies tend to do this best, even if imperfectly.
Okay, so summing up the big takeaway. The structure of politics, especially who leaders actually need support from that winning coalition size, powerfully shapes what they do. And that directly impacts how well off the population is.
Absolutely. And it explains that paradox we started with. Sometimes things that look like failure for society, poverty, lack of growth, are actually, perversely, political successes for leaders in systems built on loyalty to a select few.
It definitely gives you a different lens for looking at the world. Thinking about, different countries today, how big is their real winning coalition? How might that be driving the decisions we see?
Exactly. What does this tell us about the challenges of trying to promote better governance, democracy, economic development around the world? It suggests just changing leaders might not be enough if the underlying structure and incentives remain the same.
A lot to think about there. Understanding those hidden mechanics of power seems crucial.
It really does. It moves beyond just ideals and looks at the hard calculus of political survival.